What up, HyperChange? Welcome to an exciting episode. Today, we've got a super epic podcast lined up all about rockets and SpaceX. I've got two legendary guests here, Sam Korus from ARK Invest and Aaron Burnett from Mach 33 Research, who just put out this SpaceX valuation model kind of through ARK Invest and their research arm, valuing the company at 2.5 trillion in 2030, and one of the most thorough and impressive valuation research reports on SpaceX I've ever seen, and just kind of opening this new idea and Pandora's box of like how to value the new space economy. And with SpaceX being like the blue chip company in that space. So super fired up to dive into that. Welcome to the show, Sam and Aaron. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great. And yeah, this really started because Aaron and Mach 33, they've been doing deep dive work on SpaceX for a while. We've been doing deep dive work, probably less deep than Aaron and Mach 33. And he reached out and he said, "Have you guys thought about this?" And then uh hours and hours later, really got to give the shout out to Vlad and Daniel, who were in the trenches in the Excel, making it robust enough to handle all the assumptions we threw at it.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I think thorough or deep or some other synonym there is kind of what we like doing. Maybe
Yeah.
too deep or too thorough sometimes for most people. So it was really good working with Ark and with Sam, Daniel, and Brett, and they kind of helped us level it up a little bit and make it not just a better model, but also I think a model that is a little bit more accessible and understandable to a much broader audience. I think 1+1 was maybe three in this situation.
Yeah, extremely thorough model, which I'll link to in case people want to dive into it and really nerd out. And I also wanted to take the approach of like, let's talk about the high level of what's going on here. I mean, SpaceX is one of the most fascinating companies in the world, worth 350 billion in its last funding round. If you tried to buy stock in it, it would probably be worth 450 billion if you could even get your hands on it, and no one really even knows what the true financials are. Like, it's fully private. It's so interesting to try and unpack, wait, this could be worth 2 to 3 trillion dollars. You're saying it would be one of the largest companies in the world, potential to be up there with the largest with Tesla. So I feel like that is kind of insane in itself. So before we go into what it actually does to get to that valuation, I was going to throw a curveball at you both, which is, are you invested in SpaceX? Sam, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yes. So the ARK Venture Fund, the largest position in it is SpaceX. So that was great to have that ability, and I think the ARK Venture Fund. I'm going to be complying here. I don't know what I can and can't say about it, uh, but we are invested. We are invested in it through it. People can check it out. The design of it was really geared towards retail investors being able to invest in private companies, and so I encourage people to check it out.
Super cool. Okay. And Aaron?
Uh, yeah. We're invested through a couple of different partners that have been able to graciously allowed us to join them in significant investments into SpaceX. So definitely putting our money where our mouth is, I guess, is part of the core thesis there.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting thing we don't have to get into of how to even invest in SpaceX, but you have to like without that ARC fund that you mentioned, Sam, you have to go through like I'm invested, but it's through secondary transactions, not through the company. So am I actually invested? I don't even know. Like I could easily I don't I genuinely am like I could get screwed over. I don't know. So for that, because I know people are gonna ask that, like, how do you invest in SpaceX? It's like impossible. You have to go through a third party or be a super important VC firm, kind of like I guess ARC, and somehow invest through them. But we don't have to get too much into that. But I just think it's so interesting that it's not public and that so many people want to invest and there's such a pent up demand for it. Is kind of this interesting like dichotomy that I'm curious if it will ever sort of meet in the middle. But so with SpaceX, what is the main driver of their value? Like that $2.5 trillion valuation today. My curious, and it's kind of a complicated question to unpack, but essentially, like, who's paying them? Who's the customers? Is it all of Starlink? Is it the launches, Or how do you think about super simply kind of like bucketing out the valuation of SpaceX in terms of which businesses it owns?
Yeah, so Aaron, I'll start off and then you jump in. In the 2030 timeframe, it's very much Starlink driven, right? And so, we think launch is going to continue to grow, but really what's going to drive the revenue and the valuation there is Starlink and Starlink derivative. So it's like in that we'll throw in Starshield and direct to consumer. And so for those who don't know, Starshield is essentially the government or Space Force government contracts uh, paying them. But really, it's going to be driven by that core capability of offering connectivity from space.
Yep. And then just the other layer of that will be, launch is still in there, of course, but it's pretty small. I want to say, I forget the number exactly, but I think it was sub 10% when we were forecasting this out in 2030 as far as revenues were concerned. So yeah, it's definitely driven by Starlink or derivative, some sort of revenues. In addition to that, it is I think it's kind of makes sense in the way that money is really being made with space companies today in a significant way with high margin. It's can you have kind of an application where you're driving your own demand? And SpaceX is the preeminent example of that. I mean, they own the launchers. They have the ability to build all these starships and Falcon 9s. They have the ability to build the satellites, thousands of them, and then they have the ability to pump out millions of terminals. These are all very difficult things to build. So if you can control that vertically integrated, this is when you get to kind of harvest some of those returns ultimately is from the consumer through broadband and government from networking via Starshield.
And what's the best way to think about the Starlink network? Like how many satellites do they need to launch? What percentage are they towards launching it? And the way you break it down is really interesting in terms of the financials, which is something about like capacity, like TBPS, which is you have it at 19,000 by 2030. I'll put up this chart.
So we've tried to simplify it as much as possible and go from a top-down approach in terms of capacity. But it's like one way you can think about it is you send up a satellite, and one satellite doesn't necessarily do anything because it's only in a specific geography, but you've got them equally distributed all across the world. But let's say you send up one satellite, when it's over America, it's charging what people in America will pay for internet. But that same satellite then it goes over the ocean. Then maybe you're making money because cruise ships are paying what cruise ships will pay for connectivity. But then it goes over sub-Saharan Africa, and people in sub-Saharan Africa aren't going to pay the same price that the US pays. And so they'll be able to pay less than that. But there's far more people who need connectivity. And so that's like a single satellite's journey over the Earth, but you want to take the average of everything. So we say, just walking from the very top down, it's like, here's the satellite. Each satellite has this much bandwidth. And so you multiply number of satellites times bandwidth, and that's that overall capacity number. But then to get what people are willing to pay, you have to look at the country's rural population or number of people who aren't connected. I think it's the ITU that says it's like their definition of affordable internet is like 2% of GNI, so gross national income. And so you take that for each country and you say, this is what they'll charge, even though that's, I think, a conservative assumption. And then that's essentially how you get that potential revenue curve. I don't know if that made sense. It's still complicated walking through it, but that's
No,
like
no, it
the
makes
very
sense.
simple breakdown.
And even just to benchmark it simply, like the bull case was around 200 billion in potential revenue by 2030, I think, which seems like a ton. But I'm curious, what are we at today? Like, what's your estimate? Around 10 billion?
Yeah, and oh, go ahead, Aaron. You're
Yeah.
you're, you're probably
Well,
more in the weeds on this.
are you talking about total? I know that Elon just recently said they're on target for 15.5 this year. I think we had originally,
Wow.
based on the model that we were doing, was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 14. Obviously it's a Monte Carlo, so it tries to grab a range and then identify the most likely within that range. So the most likely within that range was around 14. So we were actually a little under in our original model. that we did with that we have out there with ARC, and you could play around with those assumptions, obviously. So that is where it's at today, and then you know,
And it's
I
growing
find one
like
of the
it's going like growing like crazy. So it's got to keep that in mind.
yeah,
It's like every estimate you see, it's like, oh, is that 6 months old? It's probably grown like 50%. So
yeah, and that's I think one of the more important pieces here is the TAM kind of analysis that ARC did, which really kind of helps to break it down, trying to simplify here around you know bandwidth per second, and what you pay for that. Is it megabits per second or gigabits, and just how you divide that out. But if you look at the chart that ARC has, that has kind of the I think they have it titled here. I'm not gonna pull it up, but modeled SpaceX bandwidth metrics. You can kind of it does a really good job of kind of explaining what Sam was walking through, and I think that really helps for for people to understand, because effectively we're going to be bathed in bandwidth here as humans, all of a sudden over the next 5 years. And that is going to have an impact on prices, going to have an impact on connectivity. And what we learned when we were kind of doing our own modeling on SpaceX was that a lot of people out there just kind of threw their hands in the air. So it'll be big. And they hoped it was into the trillions, but no one ever really wanted to take a stab at what a 2030 looked like. And so that was really important, because if you're looking at something where 90% of your revenue is coming from effectively a single source, I mean, the constellation of Starlink or its derivatives, then you really kind of need to have a sense of where that can grow to and what kind of curve starts to apply when you have so much bandwidth and the costs start to come down. So I found that chart to be very insightful, and I think people should check it out that's on ARC's blog.
and it's crazy because I feel like at first Starlink was such a almost kind of like a toy. It seemed like just for super like lightweight, not much bandwidth, like it's just going to be super small connectivity, not much data. But it seems like it's kind of slowly become this thing where it's like, wait, this is actually going to have a ton of bandwidth and people are using it for like streaming video games and all that kind of stuff. So would you say they've kind of downplayed that and now it's actually a serious contender for like I don't want to say fiber, but almost fiber, like pretty much 90% of use cases that people would need it for on the internet.
Aaron, you go first on this one.
Um, it's probably, I mean, you say this and then you look stupid 5 years from now, but it probably is not really a competitor to fiber ultimately from a latency perspective and all of that. It really doesn't do that. It's more of a where you really see the opportunity is compared to cable, like where I live, or anything that's sub cable. Think like DSL and stuff like that. I grew up in like a small town upstate New York. I never had internet. We did internet with a satellite. It was absolutely terrible. We had DSL connection with like 5 megabits or something growing up. So it's like that is where it really stands out. And I think you see the willingness to pay, because you're going from effectively nothing to cable, better than cable kind of speeds and latency. So um, everything's a little bit dependent there, but functionally, that's I think why you see this really stand out. And ultimately, I think that's where things get kind of interesting. We've been doing some analysis on what are some of these edge case opportunities where they didn't have connection or the connection was very bad before, and maybe there's IoT cases and things that really start to spring up now because your latency is, you're able to get much higher speeds as well as really low latency comparatively to what you had before. So it really stands out for the more remote rural opportunities. That's why you see something like planes, you know, going with no connection onto a plane is like, feels like we're going back, 30 years or something when you step on a plane and you can't get connection anymore. And so that kind of thing is where you really see the biggest step change function.
And I think a huge piece of what you're talking about, Gali, is the cost decline, right? And it's like when SpaceX started landing rockets, one, everyone said, you're an idiot. You can't do this economically, right? So then it's like, okay, what does it actually look like? And then even they started doing it and they're like, okay, maybe we'll recover the rockets 70% of the time, but then they're recovering them, 99.9% of the time. And then they are like, okay, we're going to launch a skyscraper that can hold, way more than the Falcon 9. And so this cost decline, I think people are like, oh, you can do a satellite constellation. What are the economics of it? Maybe you can only launch this. And now it's like, if you have a Starship and you're using it twice a day and it can hold 60 satellites per launch, then a single Starship can launch over 40,000 satellites in a year, right? It's like, oh, that's fundamentally different.
This is a dumb question, but I'm always worried. I'm like, is that going to be too many in space, and then they might crash into one, or like they got to avoid them? Like, is they probably thought that through, but I'm just thinking like,
Well,
because
so
Yeah,
I think, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
Aaron, you go. You did real math, and I was gonna go anecdotal.
Well, it's there's plenty of people out there that would say, Kessler syndrome is the thing to be worried about. All the satellites, like the gravity thing, the old movie Gravity there, where Sandra Bullock's getting hit with, space debris. That's kind of your worst case scenario. There are plenty of active and passive measures to kind of keep that from happening. Ultimately, there's a bunch of different models out there, but some suggest you can get into, multiple millions of satellites before you really have to worry about, it's kind of a Kessler syndrome sort of taking over. So I think the projection is like 100,000, depending on who you are, tens of thousands to 100,000 kind of number over the next 5 years as far as satellites in space. And so
hmm,
that's where everything's headed. People will have to take debris avoidance seriously. There will have to be some active measures. There are plenty of people working on that. Um, but I think there's a lot more headroom than most people are willing to, or the doomers will just say whatever they want to say to make it sound like we're almost at the edge of Armageddon all the time. So I don't think that's where we're at.
And yeah, my take along those lines is one, this isn't going to be a problem. It's like there could be a bad actor who intentionally tries to cause a cascade of space debris. And I think that's one possible and a risk. But then, if you think about it, it's much more of a risk for higher orbits because if you're operating in low or very low Earth orbit, it's like the debris in theory should clear itself out every, you know, 5 to 7 years. And I do think there's going to be, evolutions here on either avoidance, collection, yada, yada, yada. And, it's one of these, to Aaron's point, it's one of these things naysayers like to say. It's like, don't interrupt the people who are actually doing it. And the people who are actually doing it are going to solve it.
totally. Okay. Well, good to know. We don't have to be worried about that. Um, on so thinking about Starlink the business, in some ways, playing like devil's advocate on it of like why it shouldn't be worth a lot, maybe is because it almost seems like in some ways a product, not a business. Like, okay, you launched third, or I think it was at first 14,000, then maybe what, 40,000 satellites, and then you beam down this certain terabytes number of internet. And then maybe the monetization of that amount of internet actually goes down over time because more fiber happens or people figure out other ways to get internet eventually. Like it's just kind of like a one trick pony of like 40,000 satellites in the sky, this many TBPS of bandwidth, and then that'll be, locked in at starting at 100 billion in cash flow and then kind of going down. Or how do you kind of, or is it just because that's like a inside the box way to think about it? They'll always be evolving, but would you kind of say Starlink is a one trick pony with that vision, or
I'm gonna pass this to Sam because they did a really good TAM analysis that we kind of based the a lot of that revenue growth off of.
Yeah, I would say the way that we're modeling it is kind of in line with what you're saying, which is there has to be a price decline, right? And it's like as you tap into people who can afford less, the prices, your average price of bandwidth is going to go down, but that unlocks greater demand. And so it is going to be a price decline leads to more quote units, which are people using more data, etc. And I think that is the path it's going to go down. But it's like as far as is it a one trick pony? I think it's very difficult to compete, right? It's like is AT&T a one trick pony? It's a huge yeah, yes, but they're doing a great job of being dominant. Right. And we have a chart contextualizing this in the greater telco revenue space. And I think it's very hard to compete with SpaceX. One, no one else has a reusable rocket that's flown orbital commercially. Two, to Aaron's point, the manufacturing of the satellites and terminals at scale. And then three, it's like, what can you offer when you first start, right? So it's like Kuiper launches 15 satellites, and it's like they need an orthogonal use case. They're not going to compete head to head with Starlink that already has 7,000 satellites, gives you global coverage, low latency at a fixed price point with support, right? And so then it's, how do you compete? You need some various way, or maybe it's like a business use case specific to Amazon or something like that, or the government's funding it because, Europe doesn't want to use an American constellation, something along those lines.
Hmm. And it's
And I would
great.
say that
Yeah, yeah, go
get
ahead.
back to like the Starshield thing. Like Starshield is a non-insignificant. It's not a insignificant. I think I'm using double negatives now. It's a relatively significant part of that model and can be quite a bit more, just depending on how that gets used. And that's a use case where um, defense and people that want certain levels of security and certain levels of prioritization on bandwidth will pay a higher premium as well. And having a a network that is always up, gets you access whenever you need to, and has like a certain level of predictability is very important to those kind of use cases. In addition to they're putting the current plan is to have other things on Starshield like optical sensors and things like that that have like a tie in to the use of a network. You can take a picture and have it onto your, backhaul through your network so you can get it to where it needs to go really quickly. So there are some additional kind of tangential use cases there. Another thing that's interesting is the laser interconnects. This is again a non-trivial part of the market, not as big as the consumer broadband part of the market. Something I don't think we even really tried to plug in here, but it kind of falls underneath a gigabit per second bandwidth download. As there's more satellites in space, it costs like some estimates are like it's $1 million per satellite to get your data down to the ground if you don't have your own network. $1 million per year per satellite. So there's a whole network there as the constellations and just general orbit has a lot more constellations in general that they have the ability to interconnect with these networks and get their stuff down faster. And if there's more connection, cheaper connection, they're going to have the ability to take more data, whether that's photos, whether that's synthetic aperture radar. There's a whole bunch of these things out there. It'll be an enabler, I think, for several other markets. But fundamentally, you're moving data and bits around, and as we've seen from the telco kind of space, it's a pretty valuable part of the economy.
Yeah, I cannot believe that they just like spun out Starlink. I don't know, it seems like almost 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago they've been planning it, but just so quickly. And now it's like these estimates that you have are 10.9 billion in revenue in 2025. Sounds like that might be low though. And then scaling to 150 billion in the base case by 2030, with 70 billion of that being cash flow, which I guess makes a lot of sense. Like once you shoot all these things up, they're just making a ton of like a super, super profitable business. So maybe SpaceX sounds expensive today at 400, 450 billion, 500 billion, but it's like, well, if they could be doing 70 billion in cash flow in just 4 or 5 years just from Starlink, that could justify 1.5 or 2 trillion alone. So that's like because you have to ask, why are people buying SpaceX hand over fist at this price? And I think it's interesting that Starlink alone could easily justify like a 5 or 10x in market cap from at least this 350 billion number. So is that safe to say, based on your model, like that kind of conclusion of like, wait, Starlink alone could make me back my money if I'm buying at 350 billion?
Yeah, I think I mean, that's our conclusion. Obviously, we're both invested in it. So consider the source. We open source it. You can put in your own assumptions. But yeah, that I would agree with that conclusion. It's, you know,
But
Tesla,
Dan,
And
I
I
from
mean,
a
guess,
not Tesla. I was going to say SpaceX. SpaceX has a crazy lead over the competition here too, right? Just from the qualitative side as well.
yeah. Well,
yeah,
this, oh, sorry. I want to throw one more thing at you. Then we're going to talk about Mars. Will they IPO Starlink? At first, they were talking about spinning out Starlink, and my gut says they were thinking about it, and now they changed their mind and won't. But Texas Stock Exchange, I don't know. Do you think they're going to IPO or spin out Starlink, or will SpaceX IPO?
Aaron, you go first, and then I'll go. We semi disagree on what will
Ooh,
happen here.
great.
I think it's, maybe it's just me being optimistic, and Elon stated he thought that that'd be the case, maybe a few years back. Um, I think it makes sense to ultimately at some point, if it is its own business, it's producing revenue, and it's a lot more of a public type of business with margins that are good and things like that, then maybe the downside is less risk, especially if you have kind of like some protections being incorporated in Texas, and you're not going to get a bunch of frivolous lawsuits and things like that. Having said that, the other side of that is, why would you, if you have enough revenue and cash flow coming into the business, if you could keep your employees happy by buying back shares and all that kind of stuff. Like, there's kind of that pro and con. Ultimately, no one really knows. I could see a Starlink IPO could free up a lot of capital for investing in Mars. I'm not saying just SpaceX. SpaceX would get capital, obviously, but there's a lot of people that are invested in Starlink and have been for 20 years. They would love to be some of the first investors in what Elon's doing on Mars, and they need like a 20-year time horizon. They would probably be some of those people that would take some of those gains from a Starlink sort of thing and put into Mars expansion. Is that the case? I don't. No one really knows. Everyone's trying to kind of roughly estimate, but ultimately there does need to be some kind of liquidity opportunity for people. So my gut says that it doesn't happen until they've got some real solid lines to whatever the next thing is for SpaceX, and that might be Mars.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the test not getting paid for Tesla, I think has left a very sour taste in his mouth for public companies. To Aaron's point, I think Mars has to be further along, and Starship needs to be rocking and rolling for him to want to do that. Brett Winton, who's our chief futurist at ARC and also worked on this model and the Mars portion in particular, brought up a good point, which is that there's probably strategic value to having a company like SpaceX or any company that's like a big national defense player being public and having uh, like a large shareholder base is probably an underappreciated positive for that company. So that's also
Hmm.
probably something that will enter the equation down the line as well.
Fascinating. There's so much pent up demand. I think if SpaceX floated right now with Starlink, it would probably be a trillion or more, but who knows? Just fun to think about. So, okay, once they make all this money from Starlink, then it's the perfect puzzle piece for their capital needs for Mars, is kind of the theory. But if you're investing in SpaceX, it's like, okay, well, they're going to make all this money on Starlink, but then they're going to spend it to send who knows what to Mars, and who's going to pay for that? How is that going to make money? So that's a whole that we could scheme on that forever. But I guess I'm curious, how did you think about this next phase of the model? Because you kind of broke it down in these two different windows of expected value. You have just SpaceX, and then you have Earth, or that's Earth, and then you have plus Mars. So, and then that's where, 10, 15 years from now, we have this much bigger potential for like even 10 or 12 or $15 trillion for SpaceX, not just a couple trillion. It sounds like, if they can settle Mars. So, tons to unpack there. But yeah, maybe give us the high level breakdown of this kind of unique value disparate array of outcomes that we're dealing with here.
I'll just jump in quickly to kind of give the context for this. I think this was, I appreciate that Ark was willing to do this. Sam and Brett were willing to do this, because for me, I think it was important. There's a lot of hand waving about Mars. Elon wants to do it to effectively save humanity and have redundancy, if you will, for any kind of cataclysmic event on Earth. Um, that seems pretty obvious. I believe that he's going to do it, and he has the capability, the money, and all that's required to do it. So, with that understanding, I felt like it was important for someone to at least put something out there, knowing that anything that's a 15-year, 20-year kind of time horizon is largely incorrect. You don't really know, but is it directionally accurate? And that's kind of one of the big reasons I think we even took a stab at it. I think it's important for people to beginning to understand and think about these things in that time horizon.
Yeah. And I think the next iteration we do, we might scheme some more because we started doing that. We started going down that route and we were just like, let's punt this. Otherwise, we're never going to get this published. And so the high level thinking is, all right, we know the goal is Mars. We know that there's probably not going to be immediate cash flow back from Mars, but they're not going to be playing in the sandbox, doing nothing, right? They're going to be building infrastructure and whatnot. And so we should attribute that as book value to SpaceX. And so that's the Mars calculation. And we really simplified it. Brett was leading this effort here. And it's like we're sending to Mars Optimi, so Optimus robots and materials. And the Optimus is going to get better and work essentially like a construction worker and take those materials and turn them into infrastructure, which are then valued at something, right? So, you know, Aaron brought this up, and this was post Elon's most recent SpaceX update, right? The first thing you're going to do, or they should do, is you send Optimus and they build landing pads, right? And it's like, okay, that's infrastructure that's worth something. You're not getting any cash flows off of it, but tack it on to the book value.
Painting such an interesting picture of like you're modeling a million Optimus robots on Mars. Like it's crazy that to think about what humanity and what the future will look like when that's reality, because it's on the spreadsheet, it's so easy to put in just like a million robots, but it's like, whoa, like that's gonna look crazy to have all these spaceships doing that. But and I think it's such a fascinating way to think about the value of like, okay, what's the GDP per capita of like this robot able to produce? This is what he's doing. But I don't know, that kind of assumes that they're doing valuable work and that people actually care and want to pay for it, which is such an interesting, I know it's not on you guys to prove, I guess, but such an that's what I'm so curious is we've never had an investment like SpaceX where it's like the market's Mars. I think people want to trade their SpaceX shares to go to Mars or like pay millions to go, but who knows? But then the flip side is like if you build a whole planet, which is basically like a whole country like America, what's the market cap of that? Could be trillions that I guess is SpaceX owns. So, um,
Yeah, now we're getting into the scheming, right? It's like it's
yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
the Dutch West East India companies, right?
Ooh,
And
that's
it's
a
like,
great example. Yeah, yeah.
right,
Sorry, go
you're
ahead.
sending out, what is abundant labor? It's like back then it was slaves, unfortunately, but it's like what is the abundant labor of the future is robots, right? It's like everything great. If you look at any great building or infrastructure project and you're like, wow, this has lasted the test of time, it was built by abundant labor, right? You got pyramids, you got Great Wall of China, you've got, you know, whatever whatever you want to say, right? Taj Mahal. I don't know if that's controversial or anything, but it's like abundant labor creates insanely magnificent and intricate and lasting infrastructure. Optimus is the ultimate form of abundant labor. Probably fundamentally changes how everything gets built, even on Earth. And then, right on that front, it's like, what is the value of America? Well, early on, it was resources and all of that, but also it was a fresh start, and you get Google and Meta, right? And it's like we have Silicon Valley and AI, whereas it's like overregulated in Europe, right? It's like, well, that's a very intangible thing to think about, and it's very possible Mars is going to start fresh, and they're not going to have a huge rule book and red tape and saying, oh, should we build nuclear power plants? I don't know. Don't put it in my backyard. It's like we're going to put nuclear everywhere on Mars, and it's going to be the cheapest form of energy in the universe.
Yeah, and that's I think to get comfortable with this, you have to be okay with the assumption that Elon's going to make it happen. I think he's stated it's going to happen. So there's going to be a lot of mass landing on Mars, one way or the other. Um, so if that's the case, I also, in the circles I travel in, where you're talking about frontier technology and space technology, it seems pretty evident to me there's at least a million, maybe 10 million people that today, if it was an option and it was safe and you weren't going to go to die kind of thing, there would be people lining up to go, assuming they could afford it. And so that's kind of a human trait. So if you combine those two things, there will be enough mass to Mars, and there will be enough demand for a city, maybe a fairly sizable city. Um, I think that's where you can start to see that there is actually value there. There's not just, robots that have made the entire planet a landing pad for no one to land on. I think that it's on its way there.
What is SpaceX publicly stated that it wants to do on Mars once it gets
Well,
there?
they've said they want to build landing pads. That would be like a sensible first step, right? If you can reduce the odds of making new craters via Starship impact, and that's a high ROI. It seems likely that tunnels, it's like Boring Company isn't just to reduce traffic on Earth. It seems probable that you use that technology to build the habitats and infrastructure on Mars as well. And then, the ultimate goal that's been stated over and over is you got to make life multiplanetary and you want Mars to be able to survive even if the starships stop coming, right? So that's the guiding light. And so it's okay, what do you need in order to make that happen? You need to be able to have energy. You need to be able to, you know, raise families and reproduce and all of that.
So they want to build a city essentially, which is, and then it's crazy to even think about because it's like, well, if SpaceX builds the city, do they own that city? Or
That's until the
Yeah,
Mars results of 2056.
I think it will.
yeah.
It's gonna probably try to be its own thing eventually, which is crazy to see how that. And then it's like, well, if you're a SpaceX investor, maybe you're like allowed to go on that planet, or I don't know. It's a good hedge.
Yeah, it's a that's their stated goal, make life humans multiplanetary. And that requires a self-sustaining city. That's been very clearly stated. And then the whole political component of it all, like how does that, what's the organization look like? I don't know. One of my core theses, which Sam kind of alluded to, with like maybe cheap energy because they're just throwing up nuclear and solar panels everywhere, is that I think it'll be probably one of the most significant filters for high agency people. I mean, if you're going to go to Mars to build something, you better want to be willing to build it yourself. So I wouldn't be surprised that maybe the 2050 to 2100 timeframe. I know that's really long out, but they could be the site of some of the most significant innovations just because it just really concentrated that type of persona, that type of individual. Um, and so that's where I think things are headed. Having the political side, it's really hard. I think Peter Thiel just was on. I saw some tweet today about him saying that they needed to fix the political stuff here for Mars to be able to have its own kind of for lack of a better term, political identity, as opposed to just being infiltrated by whatever we bring with it from Earth. Which I mean, you can kind of look. There's historical analogies here where you can look at that and see what happened when they tried to bring taxes to the New World on tea and things like that, right? So it's like it seems natural that sort of
Drinking
thing
tea
will
right
happen.
now. Oh, you can't see it, but
There it is. Nice. So yeah, it's impossible to know. We're talking about really far forecasts. I think the important thing is like if you are willing to anchor your assumption that Elon's going to make it happen to some extent, and that there are enough people that want to actually do it, which I believe is a foregone conclusion. You talk to enough people, 1 to 10 million out of the planet's population is really not that big. The vast majority of people will not want to go, but I think you combine those two things, there's going to be a lot of value there. And I mean, I personally would want to go. So I'm one of those people. So it's easy for me to identify with that.
any thoughts, Sam, on the I don't want to say politics of Mars, but value from building real estate of the next city on Mars?
Yeah, it's obviously hard to quantify right now, but some work that Mach 33 did too that is interesting is right, Earth is a gravity sink, right? It's like getting from Earth to orbit sucks. Going from Mars to Earth orbit is actually better. And it's like once you're already in that area, it's like if you're going to have asteroid mining or anything like that, it's probably based on Mars as well. It's like that's very potentially lucrative as well. Um, I think, yeah,
Interesting.
having ownership of key infrastructure historically has been good. I mean, obviously there's booms and busts and things like that, but it's like, you know, if you're the one who owns all of the landing pads and you are the founding member of, the SpaceX school on Mars for kids who want to read good and do other stuff good too, you know.
So, yeah, okay. Tons of potential. And then I like this idea of like less gravity. So, I guess to end, I'm kind of thinking, okay, so we have Starlink and then the settling Mars piece to really dumb it down. But then what else could SpaceX come up with that is a business we're not thinking of? Like Starlink, I wouldn't have thought of Starlink before they announced it. And then it was like, oh, wow. And, and they're in such a unique position to do it because of their reusable rockets. So, I wonder by this forcing function of innovation to get to Mars, what other businesses could they create? Or what kind of revenue streams would that unlock? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Um, well, point to point has been stated. So that's an Earth-based kind of thing. So that could happen. We don't know if that's going to be a big enough market. There's some thoughts on that that are kind of floating out there. One that comes to mind is just the orbital refueling. They're just going to have to put so much liquid oxygen. Most of Starship is liquid oxygen. They're going to have to put so much liquid oxygen on orbit that I wouldn't be surprised that any kind of nation states that if they want to go to Mars or whatever, that they might have to get their fuel from SpaceX as well, specifically their liquid oxygen for their combustion. And so those are a couple that come to mind. Maybe Sam's got some better ideas.
I mean, I think those are great. I think thinking about it's like, yeah, do they start to get if the space debris becomes an issue, do they become involved in space debris? Do they get involved in, anything else aerospace? Elon's spoken about, the electric supersonic plane, but he doesn't have enough time to do it because he's working on everything else. Maybe once, Tesla's fully autonomous, SpaceX is cruising to Mars every 2 years, then that comes into play. Um, I think an interesting and extremely relevant question for the space industry as a whole is, yeah, what other applications can be done with a constellation other than internet and observation, right? Those are kind of the two businesses out there. You got, I don't know, 20 Earth observation companies all doing their own spin on it. You've got a handful of companies going after internet. It's like what's Rocket Lab going to do, right? They're potentially talking about their own constellation of something. um could you do it's like weather satellites. It's like, could you, right, I think weather forecasting has gotten better, much better over the short term, but it's like if you go out 10 days, I don't think we've made much progress. If we have someone fact check me and give me a good 10-day forecast. But it's like, is there value to that? Can you start to like understand other pieces of the universe as well? And then moon. It's like, I think, Mars is obviously the goal. What happens on the moon? Is the moon a sensible testing spot so you don't need to wait every 2 years to do this? Um, I don't know. The future is
Physical
exciting.
resources are like
Yeah.
why you go to space. Ultimately, like big long-term physical resources, rare earth and things like that that you could find with asteroid. If you're asking about a 10-year, 5-year time horizon, kind of hard to justify that. But ultimately, if you're talking about expansion and being able as a species, you're going to need a lot of resources, and that's one of the reasons you move to the moon because potentially for the helium-3 for fusion. One of the reasons you move to Mars is because you might be able to make and launch liquid oxygen into low Earth orbit cheaper than anywhere else because of all of the water ice that's there and the ice that's there, CO2 and other things they can pull oxygen out of. And so with that in mind, like I think if you don't have resources on your map, maybe it's far out, but resources is, I think, kind of the end goal for going to space with near Earth asteroids and asteroid belt and stuff like that.
Yeah, or maybe it's the first Martians coming back to Earth after a cataclysmic event, right? Like the poles swap, the crust crumbles, and then
Oh no.
the people on Mars are like, should we go back and like run it back? And then they go back and
Wow, it's like Prometheus or something.
yeah, yeah.
Well, it does get into sci-fi because I'm always wondering like, is it like Star Trek and like where we have these ships in space, or are we colonizing mostly planets? Or and what kind of like space apps does SpaceX enable? Like it becomes this platform for space for communication, for launching. Like there's all these other companies that you mentioned, like Rocket Lab or like Varda, or like these kind of space like bubbling up in the VC space ecosystem. So I'm curious, do you have any thoughts or comments on how that unfolds? Because it seems like SpaceX could enable this whole new era of like the space economy, and that's what a lot of people are excited on. But I'm having trouble visualizing like what it is besides just going to Mars, kind of.
Microgravity is a significant thing. I think Varda and others are proving that out. It really comes down to your applications. There's use cases. It's basically the lack of gravity that is the attraction there. It's kind of weird as humans, you know, our whole lives and families' lives, everything's been under like the influence of gravity, and we consider that to be like the norm. The reality is space doesn't have that, right? And or unless you're close to a planet. And so there's a lot of things that can be done without it that we kind of are imagining from scratch. A lot of that has been done on ISS. You can do things with silicon and chips, like some of the there are some opportunities that are going to happen over the next 5 years, I would imagine, where people are trying to get compute to be much more efficient. That may require and very well could require pulling and growing crystal boules in low Earth orbit in microgravity because the crystals can grow perfectly without the influence of gravity. That kind of thing is where I think there's a lot to be discovered there. And that could be a whole infrastructural economy around the globe that's flying over our heads. I don't know if that's 5 years out, 10 years out. I would love it to be five, but might be more.
And Gally, I think you asked the key question, right? I think in space, looking at all these, it's like the two questions that we always ask when looking at space companies is like, is this a solution in search of a problem? Number one, right? Because I think that's, you know, ultimately what you're asking, right? It's like, what are the apps? And people are like, oh, this could do something amazing, but no one wants it, and it's not an issue, so it doesn't matter. And then two is execution, because I think executional inertia is very real, right? It's like, and space is unforgiving. So it's like companies who are executing well tend to continue to execute well, and companies that are not executing well rarely have the, the margin, comfort, or time to turn things around. And so it's like those, if you ask those two questions and you can get a clear answer, I think then that's like, okay, this is an interesting company. And if not, then it's a much tougher proposition in the space economy.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on the show. I love the fact that you're putting the numbers and like math to this because I think it's the start of this new kind of space economy era, and SpaceX is like the elephant in the room that we have to talk about and analyze even though they're not public. But I like your Brett, or I guess Brett's theory about how if they're too important or they need too many shareholders, so they might need to go public as a US defense kind of company. Love that theory, because I do think it would be really cool to have a lot of people participate in SpaceX, and it's probably the most in-demand investment in the world that isn't accessible. So that's such a gap of like what the world wants and stuff. Do you have any final predictions before I let you guys go on like valuation for SpaceX, launches, anything cool? Um, yeah, or hot takes?
I mean, maybe not a hot take. We're just so early and it's so exciting. It's like, yeah, for me, the future is so optimistic. And obviously, there's lots of uncertainty and things can go all sorts of different ways. But it's like between SpaceX and space broadly, between autonomous and robotics and everything we're seeing with AI, it's like there are so many things that are very clearly going to be part of the future, and we're at square one. And so then the question's not like what's going to happen, it's how long does it take for it to happen. And that's, very exciting to me.
I think I've got a lot of hot takes, I'm sure. My one thing to maybe write down that I'm happy to be wrong about is probably within 12 months of SpaceX landing on Mars successfully. in any kind of meaningful way, um, you'll start to see the first fundraising round for a Mars focused company. Maybe Elon related, maybe not. So I think once you
Interesting.
start to see, yeah, I think that's something to kind of be looking at. And I think there will be those forward leaning people that are willing to place money into it and take that risk. That might be a lunar focused company that shifts to a Martian focused company. That might be an existing company that is now raising, you could think like a boring or whatever for let's put 10 of these boring machines on Mars and see what happens. Um, I think that's what will happen once they can prove they land, and maybe it's not the first one because the first one will blow up or there's something, and so I'm guessing that's within the 2026, 2028, I would think latest 2030 timeframe, when you start to see
Aaron, this is
companies that are
new hot
raising.
take. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, amazing
That's been
cliffhanger.
in my
Yeah,
head.
yeah. That's right. I am raising 10 million to build the first toll road from the landing pad to first tunnel.
Or bar on Mars, the Mars
Yes.
bar. I think that's what
The
a good
the
one.
space bar.